As you know, Peter is now being taken to Southwest Middlesex Prem with his closest family, which when I sat with Jan and Becky to arrange today's ceremony, left us with a bit of a conundrum, which of course the close family will be gone for about an hour. So, to ensure that you don't dash to the hotel and eat all the sandwiches before Jan and Becky get back, Jan asked me if I would tell a little more of Peter's story for his life. So I'm going to beg your indulgence for about 20 minutes. If you need to go to the loo or fidget or go, that's fine, you've been here a long time, but hopefully you will find his story totally fascinating, and it will pick up on a number of comments that have been made, certainly by John. But it'll fill you in a little more on the type of gentleman that you may have only known for a short while or may known for quite a long while. So the first thing I'd like you to do is, if possible, just close your eyes for a second. If I may, I'd like you to close your eyes and picture in your mind a 7-year-old blonde-haired little boy standing on a hill overlooking Exeter on the night of the 24th of April 1942. The city in front of him is on fire. Bombers from the Luftwaffe have dropped countless incendiary bombs, causing widespread destruction. And by morning it's clear 73 residents have been killed and 50 others seriously injured. You can open your eyes if you want now, just in case you fall asleep. Now, most of our memories we hold begin around the age of 6 or 7. And one wonders what memories were instilled that night in that little boy's mind and the part that played in influencing the rest of his life. Now I'd like you to picture in your mind the same young boy placed in a public school that was part of a strict Methodist institution. Life was tough and difficult for him, given the privations during the war. Part of his diet at the time even meant they ate whale meat. Sent away from home, he missed his family and friends. He also developed hearing problems and often had to go away to hospital. He was regularly teased in school. After all, if you're blonde, small in stature, and your name is Christopher, it wasn't long before he was being taunted by being called Christopher Robin. To add to all this, when he was 10 years old, he discovered that his parents had split up, and he realised his home life would never be the same again. Christopher Peter Matthews didn't particularly enjoy school. However, one of his saving graces at the time was that in the school library there were a number of detailed models of wooden sailing ships. The craftsmen who had made them were not skilled local artisans, but French prisoners of war incarcerated on Dartmoor during the Napoleonic Wars. The models provided young Christopher with a chance to lose himself in the detail of how boats were designed and built. He studied them over and over again in detail. And time spent in the library also meant he began a lifelong love of reading, a love that he would pass on to his children later in life. During the school holidays, Christopher would often stay with family in Whitsands in Cornwall or travel out to the far reaches of the Norfolk Broads, where his mother lived. In both locations, his escape was the pure joy of being out on the water. He would often go off for weeks at a time on his own. It was the start of what proved to be a life full of amazing adventures for the young boy who constantly set himself new personal goals to achieve. Christopher's mother, Edina, was a highly intelligent woman and philatelist. Many of his father's extended family at the time all served in the colonial service, and this again may well have influence on young Christopher as he grew. He was born in Plymouth on the 8th of January 1935, just 4 years before the outbreak of World War II. He already had a 5-year-old brother, Geoffrey, waiting for him. Christopher, although bright, was not keen on a life of academia. He was never good at maths, and he yearned to leave school with one particular personal ambition in mind. He wanted to own a motorbike. When he left school, he moved in with his mother in Norfolk, and he began his working life at Norwich Union, building society in accountancy. Now, given his dislike of maths, this seemed an odd placement, but his only focus he had at this stage was to earn enough money to buy himself that motorbike. And buy one he did. It gave him the great sense of freedom and escape that sailing had provided, but this time on dry land. And throughout his life, Christopher developed a great taste for travelling at high speed on the open road, and it will be the start of a love of fast cars and travelling great distances, whether on land or on sea. The only thing that put a stop to his motorcycle adventure and an unsuitable job was he was called up to do his national service. It also brought to an end the name Christopher Matthews and the beginning of Peter Matthews. Having learned the hard way after being teased at Shearbar College in his youth, he was not going to make the same mistake again. Peter's father had gone into the RAF in World War II, and his brother Geoffrey went into the Merchant Navy. But although Peter loved sailing, he chose to go into the army. It changed his entire life. National service for Peter gave him an immense purpose and a place to grow and make his mark. He was initially posted to Germany, and Peter would often comment on some of the little luxuries they enjoyed. Simple things like chocolate, still not available back in England after the war. Peter thrived in the army, and his rapid development was quickly recognised by his seniors. He was chosen to go on further training. He returned to England and attended Eton Hall Officer Cadet School. And Peter was in his element. Although there was strict discipline in the army, he recognised the need to work as a team, to give of one's best and support others doing the same. Later it became clear that one of his passions was to see his comrades achieve their own ambitions, and he assisted with additional training, including skiing and sailing, as John referred to. After completing his training, Peter was commissioned into the Royal Army Ordnance Corps and was posted to Libya. The British Army was acting in a peacekeeping role, and although Peter saw no action, it appears his greatest memories of the time was the social scene. Libya was a regular stopover for the crew of British commercial airline flights, and it often meant there were plenty of pretty air hostesses looking for some rest and relaxation. Unoccupied gentlemen of Her Majesty's forces were more than happy to show their guests around the local area. And I shall say no more on that. As the Suez crisis loomed, Peter prepared to be deployed. He embarked on a requisitioned cruise liner, and so began another very comfortable period of time for him. With beautiful lounges, dining rooms, bars and a swimming pool, any fears of going into battle were kept well at bay. And whilst heading to the Suez, word reached them that the crisis had subsided. So Peter's comfortable Mediterranean cruise, unfortunately, came to an abrupt end. He returned to England, to Norfolk, where, at a local Saturday night dance, he met the woman who became his first wife, Nina, and they were married in Norwich Cathedral in 1958. 2 years later, Peter was then posted to Cyprus, and at this point both he and Nina were blessed with their first child, a boy born in Decalia, who was called Geoffrey. To initiate little Jeff and Nina into the world of sailing, Peter decided to take the pair on a short sailing trip from Cyprus to England. In a boat he built himself, a small wooden sailing craft less than 30 feet long, named Lotus. They set sail from Cyprus through the Ionian Sea, past Paxos, west to Sicily through the Tyrrhenian Sea and up the west coast to Italy, then along the French coast to Sète, through the Canal du Midi and out into the Atlantic Ocean at Bordeaux, before heading north to England. I remember this was in the days before any sat-nav aids, mobile phones or ATMs to get currency. They had very little food, and they were also shot at off of Albania en route. The full journey must have been around about 3,000 miles. But by the time they reached the coast of northern France, Peter's army leave had expired, so they had to get back to England by other means. Peter was next posted to Blackdown Camp in Surrey, and in 1964 the family of 3 expanded to 4, with the arrival of baby girl Becky, born in Cambridge Military Hospital. In 1968 the family was posted to Munster in Germany, where Peter went on attachment to the 4th Armoured Division. Even though she was only 4 or 5, Becky recollects local families would come and visit them whilst in Germany. And she vividly remembers one particular German gentleman who cried when he left, distressed about what the Nazis had done to the English. Peter was ever gracious and showed great empathy with those he came across and worked with in Germany. The family returned to England again, this time to Bicester. But sadly, Peter and Nina separated. Nina went back to Norfolk with the children, and although Peter would go back to Germany, he continued to see Jeff and Becky as often as he could, and he would write to them regularly. Peter's mother, Adina, was by then running a very successful, world-famous little shop called Stamp Corner in one of the prettiest old parts of Norwich, Helm Hill. Just prior to being posted once more back to Germany, to 16 Battalion, Peter bought his next boat project. This time, as has been mentioned by John, the craft was made of concrete, or ferro cement to be exact. The boat itself was being built in a back garden behind a row of semi-detached houses. And before the owner began to build the large concrete yacht, he had got an agreement he could take the boat through a neighbour's garden. However, before he finished the project, he fell out with his neighbour, who then refused to allow access to his land, and the boat was stranded. Peter loved nothing more than a challenge. Made of concrete, exceptionally heavy, and perceptibly marooned, there weren't many buyers, so Peter paid just £150 for the large craft. And a picture appeared on the front of the local newspaper showing a concerned but determined military officer as he watched an immense crane winch the huge, hefty concrete hull with only centimetres to spare through a tiny gap between the houses. The boat was then transported down the Thames to near the London Apprentice pub in Isleworth, where she was launched with the name Jebec, after Peter's two children, Geoffrey and Becky. Peter fitted the boat out and then sailed her across the North Sea to the coast of the Netherlands and along the River Maas to Roermond. Now posted in Bracht in Germany to 3 BAPD, it was only half an hour or so by car from Asselt Lake to where Jebec was permanently moored, and it meant Peter lived on her full time, and Jeff and Becky would often go over and stay with them. Two great memories the family have of his sailing prowess at this time. The first was when Peter, dressed up to the nines in his finest Prince of Wales suit, managed to overturn his dinghy between the ship and the shore. And the second being when he managed to repeat exactly the same feat, but this time in full military uniform. I mentioned previously about Peter's love of fast cars, and Becky has another strong memory around a similar time of sitting on her father's lap and steering an Aston Martin DB4 around Hethel at high speed. It would be one of 4 Aston Martins that Peter owned in his life, along with a number of Porsches, and he started with a Lotus Elan. In 1974, Peter began the next big adventure in his life. Now stationed in Bielefeld, the headquarters for the fighting command of the British Army on the Rhine, Peter had risen to the rank of Officer Commanding Headquarters Company, a major. At the same time, a young Englishwoman, Jan, who had been teaching in Cyprus, began a new job in Rheindahlen in Germany, also for BAOR. Aged just 25, the young teacher had returned to England and bought herself a little Fiat, taken the ferry across the channel and driven herself, again with no mobiles or sat-navs, and set herself up in a British civilian mess where, on arrival, she knew no one. She joined in with all the expats and began to meet a lot of new people, one of whom was a young man called Brendan Shilton. They became good friends. Brendan spoke fluent German and was often mistaken as a local. He was always the life and soul of many a party or meal, just one of those guys who knew everyone. On a regular basis, he would often say to the young teacher, "You know, you really must meet my friend Peter Matthews." And when the first opportunity presented itself, Brendan engineered a meeting between the major and the new teacher. The two gentlemen were planning a skiing trip with 2 other friends arriving from England. Both the chaps only owned 2 two-seater Porsches. So they decided to commandeer the young teacher's Fiat for the trip for 4. Her recompense was she would get one of the Porsches for 2 weeks. Whilst in the bar, a friend of Jan's, Bridget, inquired whether she herself had ever gone skiing, to which the swift answer was no, never. So the pair jumped into the Porsche and drove down to the south of Germany to link up with the guys. They went to the nearest town and hired boots and skis. And after a short ski lift ride, Jan found herself atop of a mountain on her own. She was obviously nervous, but even more perplexed when, however much she tried, she couldn't get one of her boots on, let alone attach her skis. Just at the moment, who should appear beside her but Brendan, who kindly informed her she had hired 2 left boots. He promptly skied off on his own and left Jan stranded. Then, just like in the movies, who should come skiing towards her in his bright red ski suit and his white ski boots but a knight in shining armour, the very tanned and handsome Peter Matthews. Jan explained her predicament to him, and in his usual gallant and debonair fashion, he offered to take her back down into the town to sort out her boots. They were smitten with each other and spent the whole day together just talking, eating and drinking. It was the start of something very special. During early conversations, they discovered Peter had been born about the same time in the same nursing home as Jan's elder brother in 1935. The very same nursing home in England where Jan had also been born a year after the war. And so the romance began with Jan in Rheindahlem and Peter in Bielefeld, about a 2.5 journey between them, and the route also involved passing Jebek's then mooring place. During the long, hot summer of 1976, Peter had taken up his next posting as Commander of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, London District, where he worked in an office that overlooked Horse Guards Parade. This meant Jan, still in Germany, would often have to drive from Mönchengladbach to Calais to meet Peter, who would travel over on the ferry, and they would spend wonderful weekends together. Peter soon made plans to bring Jebek back to England. They sailed her from Roermond along the Maas River to Woedenstad on the north coast of Netherlands. And in August 1976, just as the hot summer ended, they brought her back in appalling weather, including having young Jeff on board who had a broken arm. They brought Jebek into the Medway and moored her up north, and Peter and Jan would go on to sail around the Medway area when they could. They then eventually took her to Thorney Island in Solent. Back in London, Peter was up for further promotion. The interviewing panel, however, who wanted to promote him this time, particularly needed a married man in the position as an officer. He was able to inform them his wedding was actually due to take place the very Saturday following the interview. And so on July the 26th, 1980, Jan and Peter got married with a host of friends and family around them. On a scorching hot day, the wedding took place in Plymouth, both Peter and Jan's place of birth. And the weather was so hot and beautiful, most of her guests ended up going for a swim in the evening. Truly happy memories for Jan. And so it was, Peter became the commanding officer of the training battalion and depot of the RAOC back at Blackmore, known as Deep Cut. Jan continued teaching in Wandsworth, and she would daily commute up the A3 and eventually became deputy head of the school. After 4 years in post at Deep Cut, Peter was posted to Command Ordnance Depot in Ashford and commuted on a weekly basis. It was now the start of the 1980s, and as they looked to their future, Peter and Jan purchased a cottage in Lower Sunbury, and they finally left behind their life in army accommodation. However, they didn't settle there for long. After a particular trip to the hairdressers one day, Peter picked up Jan in the car and surprised her by saying he'd seen something that they might want to buy. Assuming it was a piece of furniture or other item, imagine the surprise on Jan's face when it turned out to be a very dilapidated old bungalow directly opposite Shepperton Lock. A handwritten notice was a telephone number, and Peter called the owner to seal the deal. It would be the start of Peter and Jan's next big adventure, building a new home for themselves from scratch, again mentioned by John earlier. Peter by now had left the army and got a position as a retired officer, RO1. And he was employed by the MOD to assess and look after a vast property portfolio they owned across the southeast of England. He managed a business with a huge budget of around £70 million and was pretty much his own boss. It also meant he had regular knowledge of various reclamation locations that might provide architectural items for the exterior and interior of his new house. Blind oak church panels, doors from a bank, all became fair game for Peter and Jan's grand design by the river. The swimming pool was built first, but it didn't take long before the house was completed with a beautiful carved front door from Devon and, as mentioned, an amazing large glazed window looking out over the river. Even the ornate wrought iron lamp post that stands proudly in the front garden from Herring & Sons in Chertsey, bought for Jan by Peter, as her maiden name was Herring. Once the house was completed, Peter and Jan renamed it Swift's Lodge, after words from a poem by Jonathan Swift, which said, "All he wanted was a home with a room to board a friend and a river at my garden's end." The couple also began spending a lot of time in Corfu, where they chartered boats for various sailing holidays. Peter loved the Ionian Islands and he wanted to take Jan to see them. Back home, Peter and Jan were always well known for their hospitality, for friends and family. And in 1999 they held a special My Retirement party where many guests came dressed as sailors. And Peter fully retired in May 2000. They both joined the Desborough Sailing Club and Jan joined the Shepperton Aurora Rotary Club. Peter felt that a step too far and commented, "The last thing I joined was the army, and look where that got me." However, as he always became a true and loyal friend of those in Rotary. But Peter's focus was sailing, and not only on the Thames, but in the Mediterranean and the Ionian Seas. So he and Jan bought their final boat. A project, of course. This time they called the boat Harlequin, as mentioned by John, due to her checkered past. It had apparently sailed the world and was now moored in southern Italy, and so began yet another adventure for this couple. The boat was moored in a very poor area of Italy and very little resources, so everything to upgrade her had to be shipped over very long distances. As mentioned, they bought a caravan and would travel down to Harlequin whenever they could, driving through the Channel Tunnel and all the way to Sibari, a distance of over 1,500 miles. She would take 2 or 3 years to complete, and as soon as she was finished, Peter and Jan took her from the Bay of Taranto to the Greek island of Corfu to sail around the Ionian Islands, one of Peter's most treasured places on earth. They built many great friendships. At night they had wild parties on board with drinking, dancing and fancy dress, whilst during the day they sailed under clear blue skies in the heat of the Mediterranean. They cruised around Ithaca and Kefalonia and along the Greek coast. Friends and family would occasionally join them and enjoy their great hospitality. It was an amazing way to spend their retirement, and I know Jan feels blessed to have been with such a loving and adventurous husband for so long. But in the summer of 2017, Peter suffered a stroke whilst on Harlequin, which badly affected his mobility. He was in a very poorly way, and although the hospital in Corfu did their best for him, standard of care just wasn't enough, and the family were deeply concerned. The earliest opportunity, Peter's family, with the help of EasyJet, flew him back to England. One of their best friends, Brian Holt, collected them at the airport, and on their return, when they got home, but Peter deteriorated quickly and he was taken into St Peter's Hospital. Over the following months, with support from his family and specialist carers, Peter began to make slow and steady progress. Eventually, he was able to get to a point where he could walk on his own up to the Warren Lodge Hotel. He would sit there and read his book and look across the river at Desborough Island. He would also get to sail on Diamond, their little boat on the Thames, moored locally. Good friend Richard Cowlard would often helm for Peter, and one of the last things Peter was able to do was join the Platinum Jubilee River Pageant this summer. And what a lovely summer to have had as your last. Over the last couple of years, Peter began to have further health issues, one of the cruelest of which was having difficulty in swallowing. And for a man who loved socialising, eating and drinking with friends, that was one of the most difficult challenges for him and Jan to deal with. On the 29th of September, just 6 weeks ago, aged 87, Peter died peacefully at St Peter's Hospital. Undoubtedly, the highlights of his life would have been his 50-year loving relationship with Jan. He treasured his two children, Jeff and Becky, and was delighted when they found their partners, Katie and Matthew. He was, of course, delighted to become grandfather to Claudia, Isabel, Andrew, Philip and Thomas, and then went on and became a great grandfather to Theo and Emily, who sadly didn't last the course. But if Peter was able to possibly choose his most favourite time in his life, it probably would have been with friends under sail. Peter was a kind, generous, gentle man who always saw the best in everyone and always tried to get the best out of everyone he knew and worked with. He was an honourable man with strong Christian values and always knew the right thing to do. There was always that possibility that being born in Plymouth, Peter would become a sailor. But he was more than a sailor. He was a captain, a commander, a leader of men who always took responsibility not only for his own decisions, but also helped so many others reach their full potential by believing in them and encouraging them. I started this eulogy by mentioning the little 7-year-old boy watching the city of Exeter burn. It was therefore highly ironic that so many years later he would be awarded an MBE for his role in charge of London District, managing and directing the army during the firemen's strike in 1977. He helped oversee the re-emergence of the Green Goddesses and ensured his soldiers were fit to undertake whatever was necessary to help protect the capital during a very vulnerable time. Peter did not have the very best start in life, but he never dwelt on his past. He constantly focused on his next big task, and he filled every stage of his life with adventures and personal challenges, always underlined by that constant love of loyal camaraderie with his family, friends, his comrades and other great friends. When young officer Peter and his close friend Leslie, as mentioned previously, were told, after getting into too many scrapes, that they would never be allowed to serve together again, they had other ideas, and their careers and social lives constantly converged, and Peter valued greatly the almost 60 years of close and special friendship with Leslie. I'd like to finish, no groans, that's quite good. I'd like to finish with some very special words that pretty much sum up the man we have just said farewell to today. They come from a high-ranking commanding officer in one of several reports that Peter received whilst in the army. They give some indication of the high regard he was held in by his seniors. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews shows keen ability in staff management and particularly staff training, always alert to the needs and welfare of others. He sets the very best example. His workload is enormous, but he takes it all in his stride, always cheerful, whatever the pressures. Totally loyal and professionally agile, he addresses his duties with a marked degree of elan. He is an urbane and mentally youthful man who blends his busy working schedule with a stylish slant. Dear Peter, if you were here, everyone here and those that have had the fortune to know you throughout your long life will recognise every sentiment expressed by that senior army officer. For me, it was a pleasure to know Peter for a short while, and it's been an honour and a privilege to tell his story. And along with all of you here, his family and friends, we now wish him a safe journey to wherever he now heads, and hope that he enjoys his great next adventure. We hope he rests in peace. Thank you.